On the morning of June 3, 1942, radar operators at Dutch Harbor Naval Base on Unalaska Island in Alaska's Aleutian chain detected incoming aircraft. Within minutes, Japanese carrier-based planes swept over the harbor, dropping bombs and strafing installations. This was first attack on U.S. territory since War of 1812 and first time Japanese forces struck American soil in World War II. Attack killed 78 Americans, destroyed facilities, and stunned American public already reeling from 6 months of Japanese victories across Pacific. What most Americans did not know was that Dutch harbor attack was diversion. Real target was Midway Island 1,500 miles to south, where largest naval battle in Pacific War was about to begin. Aleutian Islands stretch approximately 1,200 miles westward from Alaska Peninsula toward Kamchatka Peninsula in Soviet Siberia. This volcanic archipelago consists of roughly 300 islands characterized by treacherous weather, frequent earthquakes, active volcanoes, and hostile climate. Fog shrouds islands 300 days per year. Rain falls constantly, wind howls at gale force, temperatures hover just above freezing even in summer. This was least hospitable battlefield in World War II and one of most forgotten. Japanese interest in Aleutians was strategic and psychological. Strategically, Japanese wanted buffer zone protecting northern approaches to Japanese home islands, particularly Kuril Islands and Hokkaido. Japanese feared American bombers might use Alaska as base for attacks on Japan. Psychologically, Japanese wanted to demonstrate that nowhere in American territory was safe from Japanese power. Occupation of American soil, even remote Aleutian Islands, would be propaganda victory and might demoralize American public. Japanese Combined Fleet Commander Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto incorporated Aleutian operation into larger plan for Battle of Midway. Japanese forces would attack Aleutians, drawing American attention northward, while main Japanese fleet approached Midway for decisive engagement that Yamamoto hoped would destroy remaining American carrier strength. Planning for Aleutian operation began in April 1942. Japanese Northern Force, under Vice Admiral Bushiro Hosogaya, consisted of 2 aircraft carriers, Ryujo and Junyo, light cruiser, heavy cruiser destroyers, submarines and invasion forces, totaling approximately 8,500 troops. Primary objectives were to bomb Dutch harbor as diversion and occupy western Aleutian islands of Attu and Kiska, establishing Japanese presence on American territory. Japanese intelligence knew Dutch harbor was major American naval base in region, with facilities submarine base and staging area for operations. Japanese believed capturing western Aleutians would extend Japanese defensive perimeter and complicate American operations in North Pacific. American forces in Alaska were minimal in early 1942. Dutch harbor had been hastily developed after Pearl Harbor, but remained relatively small installation. Army Air Forces had several bomber and fighter squadrons based at various fields, including Elmendorf near Anchorage and smaller fields on Aleutian chain. Navy had submarines, patrol craft, and small surface vessels. Army garrison was scattered across vast Alaskan territory. Overall, American forces in Alaska were inadequate to defend against determined Japanese attack. However, American intelligence had advantage. U.S. codebreakers had partially penetrated Japanese naval codes and knew something was planned for Northern Pacific, though exact targets and timing remained unclear. Japanese carrier strike force approached Aleutians from southeast on June 2nd. Weather was typically terrible with thick fog and rain reducing visibility to few hundred yards. Japanese navigators struggled to locate targets. On morning of June 3rd, weather cleared briefly, allowing first strike wave of 36 aircraft from carriers to locate and attack Dutch harbor. Japanese bombers and fighters caught Americans partially prepared. Radar had detected incoming aircraft, but response time was minimal. Anti-aircraft fire was sporadic. American fighters scrambled but could not intercept all attackers. First strike wave hit Dutch harbor approximately 17:43 hours June 3rd. Japanese bombers targeted fuel storage tanks, barracks, and docked vessels. One bomb hit army barracks, killing 25 soldiers. Another struck hospital. Fuel tanks ignited, sending black smoke thousands of feet into air. Strafing runs by Japanese fighters damaged aircraft on ground and killed personnel in open. Attack lasted approximately 30 minutes before Japanese aircraft withdrew into fogbank. American defenders were shocked by sudden appearance of Japanese carriers so far north. Dutch harbor was supposed to be beyond range of Japanese carrier operations. Presence of Japanese fleet in Aleutians suggested major operation underway. Second strike wave came next morning, June 4th. Japanese launched 46 aircraft for follow-up attack. Weather had deteriorated again, making navigation difficult. Some Japanese aircraft got lost in fog and returned to carriers without finding targets. Others located Dutch harbor through breaks in clouds and pressed attacks. This time, American defenders were better prepared. Anti-aircraft fire was heavier. American fighters, including P-40 Warhawks, engaged Japanese attackers, shooting down several aircraft. Japanese bombers hit remaining fuel storage facilities and strafed parked aircraft. One bomber crashed near Dutch harbor after being damaged by anti-aircraft fire. Crew survived and became first Japanese POWs captured on American soil during war. Second attack was less effective than first due to weather and American resistance, but still caused significant damage. Total casualties from Dutch harbor attacks were 78 Americans killed and approximately 70 wounded. Facilities damage was substantial, but not crippling. Fuel storage was depleted, forcing Americans to rely on shipments. Some buildings were destroyed. Several aircraft were damaged or destroyed on ground. However, harbor remained operational, and American forces could continue using base. From Japanese perspective, attack achieved psychological goal of striking American territory, but tactical results were limited. More importantly, attack failed in its primary purpose as diversion. American naval commanders, including Admiral Chester Nimitz, correctly assessed that Aleutian operation was secondary to main Japanese thrust at Midway. American carriers remained concentrated at Midway, where they would achieve decisive victory June 4th through 7th. While Dutch harbor attacks grabbed headlines, larger Japanese plan unfolded at westernmost Aleutians. On June 6th, Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces went ashore on Kiska Island, meeting no resistance. Island was occupied only by small American weather station staff of 10 men who were captured and became prisoners for duration of war. Japanese immediately began constructing base facilities and defensive positions. Next day, June 7th, Japanese forces occupied Attu Island, westernmost inhabited island in Aleutians. Attu's population consisted of 42 Aleut natives and 2 American schoolteachers, Charles Foster Jones and his wife Etta Jones, who had lived on island teaching and running radio station. Japanese forces captured all 44 civilians. Aleuts were transported to Japan, where they were held in detention camps for remainder of war. Conditions in camps were harsh, and approximately 20 Aleuts died during captivity. Charles and Etta Jones were also taken to Japan and died in captivity September 1945, just weeks after Japanese surrender. Their deaths remain controversial, as exact circumstances were never fully explained. Japanese occupation of Attu and Kiska represented first time since War of 1812 that foreign power controlled American territory. Impact on American morale was significant. Press coverage emphasized that enemy forces occupied American soil. Public demanded immediate action to recapture islands. However, military reality was complex. Attu and Kiska were over 1,000 miles from major American bases. Weather made operations difficult most of year. Japanese had established defensive positions and garrison of approximately 5,000 troops on Kiska and 2,500 on Attu. Recapturing islands would require substantial forces, amphibious operation, and acceptance of significant casualties. American military was already stretched thin across multiple theaters in Pacific and Europe. Aleutian Campaign was low priority compared to critical battles at Guadalcanal and North Africa. American response developed slowly through summer and autumn of 1942. Army air forces began bombing raids on Kiska and Attu from newly constructed bases at Adak and Amchitka Islands. These raids were limited by weather and range, but maintained pressure on Japanese garrisons. Navy submarines patrolled approaches to occupied islands, sinking occasional Japanese supply vessel. Most importantly, American forces expanded military infrastructure in Alaska, building new airfields, strengthening existing bases, and increasing troop deployments. By early 1943, Americans had assembled forces necessary to attempt recapture operations. Life on occupied Attu and Kiska was miserable for Japanese troops. Islands were remote with no natural resources. Everything, including food, ammunition, and construction materials, had to be shipped from Japan across North Pacific, often through American submarine patrols. Weather was relentlessly hostile. Fog made navigation and air support nearly impossible. Cold and dampness caused health problems. Japanese troops suffered from malnutrition when supply ships could not get through. Morale deteriorated as soldiers realized they were isolated and forgotten in one of the world's most inhospitable locations. Japanese commanders on islands repeatedly requested evacuation or reinforcement, but Tokyo had little to spare with demands from all across Pacific Theater. American planning for recapture focused first on Attu, as it was westernmost island and smaller garrison, made it more vulnerable target. Operation Landcrab was scheduled for May 1943, with 11th Air Force providing air support and 7th Infantry Division conducting amphibious assault. American intelligence estimated Japanese garrison at 500 to 1,000 troops. Actual number was approximately 2,800. This intelligence failure would contribute to bloody battle ahead. May 11, 1943, American forces began landing on Attu. Plan called for amphibious landings at two beaches designated Massacre Bay and Holtz Bay, with forces converging to trap Japanese in center of island. Initial landings met minimal resistance as Japanese commander Colonel Yasuyo Yamazaki had withdrawn most forces to interior defensive positions. American troops established beachheads and began advancing inland. Then weather intervened, temperature dropped. Fog rolled in, rain turned terrain into freezing mud. American troops, most from California, were not prepared for Arctic conditions. Equipment froze, weapons jammed. Men suffered frostbite within hours. Medical evacuation was impossible due to weather. Casualties from exposure rivaled those from combat. Japanese defensive strategy relied on difficult terrain and weather to slow American advance while conserving forces for counterattack. Colonel Yamazaki positioned troops in high ground overlooking American positions. Japanese snipers harassed American patrols. Small-scale counterattacks kept Americans off balance. Yamazaki knew he could not win, but was determined to inflict maximum casualties before inevitable end. Japanese garrison had no hope of reinforcement or evacuation. Tokyo had written off Attu garrison as expendable. Yamazaki and his men knew they were fighting to death. Battle of Attu lasted 19 days, May 11th through May 30th. Fighting was brutal combination of conventional combat and struggle against environment. American casualties mounted steadily. Cold weather injuries, including frostbite and trench foot, disabled hundreds of soldiers. Psychological casualties from constant exposure and stress were substantial. Japanese resistance was fanatical. Wounded Japanese troops would detonate grenades rather than surrender. Snipers tied themselves to positions and fought until killed. Small groups of Japanese conducted suicide charges against American positions, knowing they had no chance of survival. Climax came May 29th when Yamazaki led final banzai charge. Approximately 800 Japanese troops gathered for mass assault on American positions near Engineer Hill. Attack came at dawn in thick fog. Japanese troops, screaming and bayonets fixed, charged American lines. Fighting was hand-to-hand in many places. Japanese broke through initial American positions, creating panic. However, American reserves counterattacked and Japanese charge was stopped. By afternoon of May 29th, virtually all attacking Japanese were dead, including Colonel Yamazaki. Few Japanese positions remained. Final pockets of resistance were eliminated May 30th. Battle of Attu was over. Casualties tell grim story. American forces suffered 3,129 casualties, including 549 killed in action, 1,148 wounded, and 2,132 cold weather injuries, including frostbite, trench foot, and exposure. Japanese garrison of approximately 2,172 was virtually annihilated. Only 28 Japanese troops surrendered. Rest fought to death or committed rather than face capture. Body count was difficult in fog and terrain, but Americans estimated they killed approximately 2,351 Japanese, with several hundred more in caves who refused to surrender and likely perished from starvation or exposure. Battle of Attu was one of bloodiest battles in Pacific War relative to forces engaged. Casualty rate approached 70%, making it costliest American operation in Pacific theater up to that time. Attu experience convinced American planners to approach Kiska more carefully. Kiska garrison was larger, estimated at 5,000 to 7,000 troops. Island had better defensive positions. Assault would likely cost thousands more casualties. American forces assembled overwhelming force of 34,426 troops for Operation Cottage, scheduled for August 15, 1943. Bombardment ships, including 3 battleships, pounded Japanese positions for weeks. Airstrikes hit island repeatedly. Intelligence suggested Japanese were well entrenched and prepared for suicidal defense, similar to Attu. What Americans did not know was that Japanese had decided to evacuate Kiska. Losses at Attu and deteriorating strategic situation convinced Japanese high command that holding Kiska was pointless waste of troops. On July 28, 1943, under cover of fog, Japanese naval task force slipped through American blockade and evacuated entire Kiska garrison of 5,183 troops in remarkably executed operation. Americans did not detect evacuation. Reconnaissance aircraft reported seeing Japanese troops on island, though these were likely just equipment and decoys Japanese left behind. Americans proceeded with invasion plan unaware island was abandoned. August 15th, American and Canadian forces stormed ashore on Kiska, prepared for fierce battle. They found empty positions, abandoned equipment, and no Japanese. Confusion reigned initially as troops expected ambush. Patrols searched island thoroughly, finding nothing but evidence of hasty evacuation. Only casualties during Kiska invasion were 24 soldiers killed by friendly fire as nervous troops shot at shadows and mistook other units for enemy. Another 71 were casualties from booby traps, mines, and accidents. Discovery that Japanese had escaped was embarrassing for American command, but relief for troops who had expected another bloodbath like Attu. Aleutian Campaign ended August 1943 with recapture of Kiska. Japanese had been driven from American territory, however cost was substantial. American forces suffered 1,481 deaths in campaign, including those killed in combat and from disease exposure and accidents. Approximately 3,416 total casualties resulted from 18-month campaign. Japanese losses were approximately 4,350 troops killed, including Attu garrison, and naval forces lost supporting operations. Material costs were also significant. Both sides lost aircraft ships and vast amounts of supplies. Infrastructure investment in Alaska was massive, with Americans building dozens of airfields, roads, and support facilities, many of which remain today as legacy of campaign. Strategic value of Aleutian Campaign remains debated. Japanese never used occupied islands as bases for attacks on Alaska or US. Japanese were content to hold islands as buffer zone and propaganda victory. American recapture operations were necessary to remove Japanese from US territory, but diverted resources from more important Pacific campaigns. However, campaign had long-term benefits. Military infrastructure built in Alaska during war became foundation for Cold War defenses. Airfields built for Aleutian operations were used by Strategic Air Command. Radar stations established during campaign were expanded into DW line. Military experience gained in Arctic warfare proved valuable for future operations. Perhaps most importantly, campaign demonstrated to Japanese that Americans would fight to recapture every inch of territory, no matter how remote or inhospitable. Weather in Aleutians was deadliest enemy for both sides. Fog reduced visibility to 0-300 days per year, making air operations and naval movements extremely hazardous. Wind speeds exceeded 100 miles per hour during winter storms. Temperature rarely exceeded 50 degrees Fahrenheit even in summer. Rain fell constantly, making everything perpetually wet. Terrain consisted of volcanic rock tundra and muskeg swamp that made movement exhausting. These conditions caused more casualties than combat in Aleutian Campaign. Soldiers suffered frostbite, trench foot, immersion, foot hypothermia, and exposure. Disease, including pneumonia and dysentery, spread rapidly in cold, damp conditions. Mental health issues, including combat fatigue and depression, were prevalent. Veterans remembered Aleutian weather with same horror they recalled Japanese attacks. Naval operations in Aleutians were limited by weather and distance. Several small engagements occurred between American and Japanese forces. Battle of Komandorsky Islands. March 27, 1943, was largest naval engagement when American task force intercepted Japanese convoy attempting to resupply Attu and Kiska. 4-hour running gun battle ended inconclusively with both sides withdrawing but Japanese abandoning attempt to resupply garrisons. Battle demonstrated difficulty of maintaining Japanese positions so far from home bases. American submarines were most effective naval forces in Aleutians, sinking numerous Japanese supply vessels and warships. Japanese submarines operated in area but achieved limited success. Neither side committed major fleet units to Aleutian theater as resources were needed elsewhere. Air war in Aleutians was intense but often futile due to weather. American bombers from 11th Air Force flew hundreds of missions against Kiska and Attu from bases at Adak Amchitka and Umnak. Bombing accuracy was poor due to weather and lack of suitable targets on barren islands. Japanese air forces based on carriers and later on Kiska flew limited missions, mostly reconnaissance and harassment raids. Neither side achieved air superiority, though Americans had numerical advantage. Aircraft losses from weather and accidents exceeded those from combat. Pilots faced extreme danger navigating in fog, with mountains rising suddenly from sea and few emergency landing sites. Air operations demonstrated limitations of air power in adverse weather conditions. Native Aleut population suffered tremendously from war. Those captured on Attu spent years in Japanese detention camps, where approximately 1/5 died. Those on other Aleutian islands were forcibly evacuated by U.S. government to camps in southeast Alaska, where they lived in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Many Aleuts died from disease during evacuation. After war, Aleuts returned to find their villages had been vandalized and looted by American troops who had been stationed in area. Aleut way of life, based on fishing, hunting, and traditional customs, was disrupted by war and never fully recovered. This dimension of Aleutian Campaign is often overlooked, but represents significant injustice and tragedy. Legacy of Aleutian Campaign is visible across Alaska today. Abandoned military installations dot landscape from Umnak to Shemya. Rusted equipment, decaying bunkers, and scattered ammunition remind visitors of war fought in frozen north. Some facilities were maintained and expanded during Cold War, when Alaska became frontline in potential conflict with Soviet Union. Cities including Anchorage grew dramatically due to military presence established during World War II. Alaska Highway, built during war to provide overland route to Alaska, remains vital transportation link. DAW line radar stations. Cold War legacy have roots in early warning systems established during Aleutian Campaign. Modern Alaska military presence at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson and Fort Wainwright descends directly from World War II buildup. Comparison with other Pacific Island campaigns reveals unique characteristics of Aleutian Campaign. Islands like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima were tropical environments with heat malaria and jungle warfare. Aleutians presented opposite extreme with cold fog and Arctic conditions. Casualty patterns differed, with higher proportion of non-combat casualties in Aleutians. Strategic value of tropical islands was clear as bases for advancing toward Japan. Strategic value of Aleutians was ambiguous, serving primarily as buffer zone. Tropical islands received extensive press coverage, making battles famous. Aleutian Campaign was overshadowed and largely forgotten. Veterans of both campaigns agreed that Aleutians presented unique combination of combat stress and environmental hardship that made it most miserable battlefield in Pacific War. Propaganda value of campaign exceeded military value for both sides. Japan's occupation of American territory was trumpeted in Japanese press as demonstration of Japanese power and American vulnerability. However, Japanese public was never told of desperate conditions Japanese troops endured or eventual loss of islands. American press emphasized need to recapture American soil though downplayed costly nature of Attu battle. Both sides used Aleutian Campaign for morale purposes, while actual strategic impact remained minimal. Campaign served political need to demonstrate action while not affecting outcome of larger war. Forgotten nature of Aleutian Campaign puzzles historians. Battle of Attu was costlier than many better-known Pacific battles. Dutch Harbor was first attack on U.S. territory since Pearl Harbor. Japanese occupation of Kiska and Attu was only enemy occupation of U.S. soil during war. Yet campaign receives minimal attention in general histories of World War II. Several factors explain this obscurity. Campaign occurred simultaneously with more dramatic events including Battle of Midway Guadalcanal Campaign and North Africa operations. Aleutian weather prevented dramatic photography that made other battles famous. Remote location meant few war correspondents covered campaign. Veterans were scattered after war and did not form cohesive groups to preserve memory. Most importantly, campaign did not fit neat narrative of Pacific War as steady advance toward Japan. Aleutians were sideshow, not main event, and historical memory reflects this. However, for those who fought there, Aleutian Campaign was anything but forgotten. Veterans remembered bitter cold, constant fog, and miserable conditions with clarity decades later. They remembered comrades lost to combat and exposure. They remembered fear and exhaustion. They remembered questioning why they were fighting for barren volcanic rocks in middle of nowhere. Yet they also remembered pride in accomplishing mission under impossible conditions. They remembered camaraderie forged in shared hardship. They remembered that they had driven enemy from American soil, no matter how remote. For Aleutian veterans, campaign was defining experience of war, even if rest of world forgot. Individual experiences from Aleutian Campaign reveal human dimension often lost in strategic analysis. Sergeant Paul Nobuo Tatsuguchi, Japanese-American medical officer serving with Japanese forces on Attu, kept diary documenting final days of battle. His entries described deteriorating conditions, lack of food and medical supplies, and resigned acceptance of death. Tatsuguchi had been educated in United States at Pacific Union College in California and returned to Japan before war. His diary found on his body after final banzai charge provided rare glimpse into thoughts of Japanese soldier facing certain death. Irony of Japanese American educated in America, dying fighting American forces on American soil, was not lost on those who discovered diary. Private Leon Standifer of 7th Infantry Division described conditions during Attu battle in his memoir. He recalled constant cold that penetrated every layer of clothing, making sleep impossible. He described watching comrades evacuated with frostbite, their feet blackened and swollen. He remembered horror of finding Japanese soldiers who had committed rather than surrender their bodies frozen in contorted positions. Standifer wrote that Aleutian weather was more terrifying than Japanese resistance because enemy could be fought, but weather was inescapable constant presence, draining strength and will to continue. Captain William Willoughby commanded destroyer USS Pruitt during operations in Aleutians. He described nightmare of navigation through fog with volcanic peaks rising suddenly from sea and no reliable charts of underwater hazards. Willoughby recalled standing watch for hours in freezing rain, unable to see ship's bow, let alone potential threats. He described near collision with another American vessel that appeared suddenly from fog bank, forcing emergency maneuvers. Willoughby noted that destroyer captains in Aleutians aged years in months due to constant stress of operating blind in hostile waters. Technical challenges of Aleutian operations exceeded anything American military had faced. Equipment designed for temperate or tropical climates failed catastrophically in Aleutian conditions. Engines would not start in cold. Lubricants froze solid. Electronics malfunctioned from moisture. Weapons jammed from rust and ice. Aircraft required extensive cold weather modifications, including engine heaters, de-icing equipment, and special lubricants. Even with modifications, mechanical failure rate was extremely high. Maintenance crews worked around clock in brutal conditions, trying to keep equipment operational. Innovation born from necessity included development of new cold weather gear, improved de-icing systems, and techniques for operating in extreme weather that would influence military technology for decades. Medical challenges were equally severe. Doctors treating casualties in Aleutians faced conditions unprecedented in American military medicine. Frostbite and cold weather injuries required different treatment than battlefield trauma. Evacuation of wounded was often impossible for days due to weather, leaving men in field hospitals with inadequate facilities. Disease spread rapidly in cold, damp conditions. Mental health issues were prevalent as soldiers cracked under combination of combat stress, environmental hardship, and isolation. Medical personnel themselves suffered same environmental conditions as combat troops, making their jobs even more difficult. Lessons learned in Aleutian medical operations would prove valuable in later conflicts, including Korea, where cold weather casualties again presented major challenge. Logistical achievement of supporting operations across a Aleutian chain was remarkable. Every item needed for campaign, from ammunition to food to fuel, had to be shipped thousands of miles from continental United States through submarine-infested waters to primitive ports lacking adequate facilities. Weather closed harbors for days at a time. Ships waiting to unload burned precious fuel. Supplies piled up at some locations while other bases ran short. Building airfields required transporting construction equipment, earth-moving machinery, and building materials to islands with no roads, no docks, and hostile terrain. Engineers worked miracles constructing facilities in conditions that would have stopped commercial projects. Supply officers improvised solutions to problems that had no textbook answers. Success of Aleutian operations depended ultimately not on combat prowess, but on unglamorous work of logistics specialists who kept supplies flowing despite seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Intelligence operations in Aleutians combined traditional methods with new technologies. Coast watchers, Alaut scouts, provided ground-level intelligence about Japanese positions and activities. Submarines conducted reconnaissance missions, photographing beaches and coastal defenses. Aircraft flew photo reconnaissance when weather permitted, though results were often poor due to clouds. Radio intercepts provided information about Japanese communications, though codes and language barriers limited usefulness. Most innovative was use of radar, which, though primitive by later standards, gave Americans crucial advantage in detection and tracking. Radar stations established in Aleutians during war became foundation for later DU line that would guard against Soviet bombers during Cold War. Intelligence gathered during Aleutian operations also revealed limitations of Japanese logistics and sustainability that would be exploited in later Pacific campaigns. Press coverage of Aleutian Campaign was limited and heavily censored. Government did not want to admit extent of Japanese penetration into Alaska or difficulty of recapture operations. Photos showing destroyed American facilities or casualties were suppressed. Japanese occupation of Attu and Kiska was downplayed in press as insignificant, though internally military treated it as serious matter. Battle of Attu received some coverage, but casualty figures were not fully disclosed until after war. Kiska operations' embarrassing outcome was buried quickly. Few war correspondents were assigned to Aleutians, preferring more dramatic Pacific Island campaigns or European theater. Those who did report from Alaska struggled to convey unique character of campaign to public focused on battles in more familiar environments. Lack of good photographs due to weather meant Aleutian Campaign generated little visual record compared to extensively photographed operations elsewhere. Japanese perspective on Aleutian operations shows miscalculation at strategic level. Admiral Yamamoto conceived operation as diversion for Midway, believing Americans would divert carriers northward. When Americans correctly identified Midway as main target, Aleutian diversion failed completely. Occupation of Attu and Kiska achieved propaganda goal, but created unsustainable commitment that Japan lacked resources to support. Japanese planners apparently believed Americans might not consider two barren islands worth recapturing, allowing Japan to hold them indefinitely. This was fundamental misunderstanding of American psychology and determination. Once Japanese occupied American territory, recapture became matter of national honor, regardless of military value. Japanese intelligence also failed to appreciate scale of American military buildup in Alaska that would eventually overwhelm Japanese positions. Post-war Japanese accounts from survivors revealed depth of suffering experienced by troops in Aleutians. Soldiers sent to Kiska and Attu felt abandoned by homeland. Supply shipments were irregular and inadequate. Medical care was minimal. Entertainment was non-existent. Communication with families in Japan was infrequent. Men felt they had been written off as expendable. This sense of abandonment contributed to low morale and may have motivated some troops to surrender at Attu in violation of military code that mandated death over capture. Those evacuated from Kiska felt they had been granted reprieve from slow death by starvation or American attack. Few Japanese veterans speak positively about Aleutian service, considering it worst assignment of war. Comparison of leadership styles reveals interesting contrasts. American commanders in Aleutians, including Major General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., commanding Alaska Defense Command, approached campaign methodically building infrastructure, establishing air superiority, and attacking only when overwhelming force was available. This cautious approach minimized risks, but resulted in prolonged campaign. Japanese commanders, particularly Colonel Yamazaki at Attu, operated under orders to hold at all costs, despite impossible situation. Yamazaki's defensive tactics were skillful, extracting maximum casualties from Americans before inevitable defeat. However, strategic situation meant his tactical skill merely delayed rather than prevented American victory. Both sides' commanders were constrained by limitations of environment, terrain, weather, and distance from support that made Aleutians' unique battlefield requiring adaptation of normal military doctrine. Role of native Alaskans in campaign deserves greater recognition. Aleuts served as scouts, guides, and intelligence sources for American forces. Their knowledge of terrain, weather patterns, and sea conditions proved invaluable. However, Aleuts paid heavy price for war fought on their homeland. Those captured by Japanese suffered in detention camps. Those evacuated by Americans lost homes, communities, and traditional way of life. After war, Aleuts returned to find villages looted and destroyed by American troops who had occupied islands. Federal government provided minimal compensation for these losses. Only decades later did government formally acknowledge and apologize for treatment of Aleuts during war. This injustice represents dark chapter in Aleutian Campaign story. Environmental impact of campaign was substantial and long-lasting. Military construction disrupted fragile Arctic ecosystems. Fuel spills contaminated soil and water. Abandoned equipment and ammunition created hazards that persist today. Unexploded ordnance remains buried on former battlefields, posing danger to wildlife and occasional human visitors. Chemical contamination from fuel dumps and waste disposal affects local environments. Wildlife populations were disrupted by noise, construction, and human presence, though most have recovered in decades since war ended. Cleanup efforts have removed some hazardous materials, but remote locations and harsh conditions make complete remediation difficult and expensive. Aleutian Islands today bear scars of war that will remain visible for generations. Cold War transformed strategic value of Alaska and Aleutians from peripheral to critical. Soviet Union's Kamchatka Peninsula was directly across from Aleutians, making Alaska front line in potential conflict. Military bases established during World War II were expanded and modernized. New installations were built, including early warning radar stations, submarine detection facilities, and air defense bases. Alaska became staging area for operations monitoring Soviet military activities. Thousands of military personnel were stationed in state. This militarization brought economic benefits, but also created tensions with native populations and environmental concerns. Strategic importance of Alaska remained high throughout Cold War, only diminishing after Soviet collapse in 1991. However, Alaska maintains significant military presence today due to its geographic position relative to Russia and Pacific region. Veterans organizations for Aleutian Campaign veterans formed slowly after war. Unlike veterans of major Pacific battles who had large numbers and shared experiences, Aleutian veterans were scattered and relatively few. No single battle-defined campaign like Iwo Jima flag-raising or Normandy landings. Reunions were sporadic. Memorial efforts were limited. Only in recent decades has interest in Aleutian Campaign increased, partly due to veterans' efforts to document experiences before they passed away. Several memorials now exist in Alaska honoring those who served in campaign. National historic landmarks designate key battle sites. Museums preserve artifacts and stories. However, Aleutian Campaign remains one of least-known major American military operations of World War II. Dutch harbor attack June 3rd and 4th, 1942, brought war to Alaska for first time. Japanese bombs fell on American territory. Americans died defending homeland. Nation was shocked that enemy could strike so far north. Yet attack was diversion for Battle of Midway, where Japan's carrier fleet would be shattered, ending Japanese offensive capability. Japanese occupation of Attu and Kiska. June 6th and 7th was propaganda victory, but strategic dead end. Islands were too remote to serve as bases for further operations. Japan lacked resources to develop or defend positions adequately. American recapture was inevitable once resources could be allocated. Battle of Attu May 11 through 30, 1943 was brutal bloodbath in Arctic conditions. Nearly 4,000 American casualties, including over 500 killed, testified to intensity of fighting and harshness of environment. Virtually entire Japanese garrison died fighting or from suicide. Kiska liberation. August 15, 1943 ended as farce when Americans discovered Japanese had evacuated secretly. Campaign cost nearly 1,500 American lives and unknown number of Japanese. It pushed American military presence deep into Alaska, creating infrastructure that would serve nation for decades. It proved Americans would fight to recapture every inch of territory. It demonstrated that weather could be deadlier than enemy. Most of all, it showed that even forgotten battles in remote locations represented sacrifice and courage worthy of remembrance. Aleutian Campaign Frozen War in North Pacific remains testament to those who fought in worst conditions against enemy and elements to defend American soil.